Shalom Aleichem, and welcome back to Hokhmat Ha-Hodesh, our monthly exploration of Jewish time, wisdom, and practice. I am your host, Yosef Lopez, and today we enter Kisleu, or, as we say it in some Sephardic pronunciations, Kisleu, a month rich with meaning that often gets overlooked in our celebrations. For most of us, Kisleu is associated with Hanukkah, and Hanukkah brings joy, lighting candles with our families, the warmth of donuts and latkes, children spinning dreidels, the brightness of menorahs in our windows. For my family, we make bimuelos and spend dedicated time together at home. And these are beautiful traditions. There's real value to celebrating together. But I must be clear about something from the start. Hanukkah is not the Jewish Christmas. Despite our feelings surrounding it, it's not even really a holiday in the Jewish sense. It's not a biblical festival like Pesach or Sukkot or Shavuot, which is a Hag. It is one of the Shalosh Regalim, meaning that we make pilgrimage from our homes to the temple in Jerusalem, if that were the case. Nor is it a Yom Tov commanded by the Torah, such as Rosh Hashanah. So what is it? Hanukkah is a commemoration established by the sages to remember specific historical events and the divine providence manifest in them. Understanding this distinction matters because it shapes how we approach the holiday and what it asks of us. So I would like to invite you into a deeper exploration of not only this month, but of this particular holiday. One that our medieval scholars preserved, one that Rambam carefully articulated in his halachic writings. What if we examined the texts themselves? Al-Hanisim, the books of the Maccabees. See what they actually emphasize. You might be surprised by what emerges. The story is much more complex, more challenging, and more relevant than the simplified version we often hear. Let's explore together where the sources lead us. So the name Kisleu appears in our Mikra only twice. Once in Zechariah, chapter 7, verse 1, and once in the first pasuk of Nehemiah. So let's chant the verse from Zechariah with its cantillation. So it's Wai Beshanat Arba Deri'a Wushamelech Ya Dabar Adonai Zechariah Arba'im Ha-Hodesh HaTish'im Kisleu. And it came to pass in the 4th year of King Darius that the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month, which is Kisleu. So like most of our month's names, Kisleu came to us from Babylonian exile, derived from the Akkadian Kislemu. This is the 9th month, according to our count. Interestingly, though, the etymology of Kislemu itself remains unclear to us. We don't actually know what it originally meant to the Babylonians. But once this foreign word entered Hebrew consciousness, it naturally attracted folk etymologies, of course. So some interpreters connect Kisleu to the Hebrew word kesel, that is kaf samech lamed, or kisla, kisla, the Hebrew words meaning confidence or hope. We see this root throughout the Mikra and Sefer Shorashim, Radak. Rabbi David Kimchi brings us different examples of this. Or, for example, it says in Psalms, place in God chisilam. They shall place in God their confidence. It says in Job, if I made gold, chisili, if I made gold my confidence. One more example, for the Lord will be chesilecha, your confidence. The meaning centers on trust and hope each time. So what's the connection between Kisleu and hope? We It is during this month that we hope for winter rains that should begin falling in the land of Israel during this month. In this reading, Kisleu becomes a month of trust in divine providence. Others see a connection to the Kasil, that is the Hebrew name for the constellation Orion, which appears prominently in the night sky during Kisleu's darkness. In the book of Job, Kisil represents divine power over the natural order. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? I don't know how to say this word actually. Pleiades, I think is how it's translated. Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion. Orion's the hunter in the winter sky. There's something evocative about both interpretations. As we'll see, Kisleu indeed proved to be a month requiring confidence and trust. The hope and confidence of a small group who trusted their understanding of Torah against considerable opposition. And like Orion, the hunter appearing in the winter darkness, the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, became warriors preserving what they believed was being lost. To understand Hanukkah deeply, we need to look carefully at what the historical sources actually tell us. And when we do, a complex picture emerges, quite different from the simplified narratives we often encounter. The historical evidence suggests that Hanukkah wasn't primarily a war between Judaism and Hellenism in some abstract sense, not simply a clash of civilizations or a straightforward story of religious freedom versus oppression. What the books of Maccabees and other sources reveal is more complicated. The events of Hanukkah include a civil conflict, Jews in profound disagreement with other Jews about the nature of authentic Jewish practice, with the Seleucid Greeks serving largely as military backers for one faction in this internal dispute. Before we explore this history, let me clarify something important. In traditional Sephardic communities, Torah is related in a very specific way. It's laleh, sharia, it's law. This isn't religion in the modern sense of a private spiritual belief. It's a comprehensive legal system governing individual conduct, family life, and communal organization. When we understand Torah this way, as an integrated system of practice rather than a collection of symbols pointing to universal truths, the events of the 2nd century BCE come into sharper focus. By the early 2nd century, many among the Jewish elite in Jerusalem, priests, aristocratic families, political leaders, pursued what they saw as cultural advancement. And our historical sources point and describe them building a gymnasium in Jerusalem, adopting Greek educational methods, integrating Hellenistic philosophical concepts into their Jewish worldview. These weren't necessarily bad things. Many might see wisdom in some of these Greek concepts. The key tension emerges around how they viewed Torah's specific instructions. They began treating these as symbols pointing to deeper universal truths that might be expressed through other various cultural forms. This can be embodied in the person of Menelaus, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin, the high priest at the time, who went so far as to reverse his circumcision in order to better fit into the Greek cultural norm in the gymnasiums. This crisis intensified with backing from Antiochus IV, who was called Antiochus Epiphanes. And these changes reach the temple itself. What the sources describe isn't simply Greek oppression imposed from outside. It's a more complex story where Jewish leaders played active roles in transforming traditional practice, convinced they were modernizing rather than betraying their tradition. The Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, led by Mattatya and his sons, saw things very differently. For them, the specific, particular requirements of the Law of Sinai were not negotiable symbols. They couldn't be reimagined as mere pointers to universal truths that various cultures might express differently. This created an internal Jewish conflict of fierce intensity. The book of 1 Maccabees describes Mattatya's opening act confronting another Jew who was offering sacrifice according to the ways of the Greeks. Simply put, avodah zarah, forbidden worship, which is seen as treasonous by the Torah. The text portrays Hasmonean forces throughout Judea working to preserve what they understood as the authentic Torah practice. It leads to a military confrontation with Seleucid forces, and it becomes part of this larger internal struggle over the question, what does faithful Jewish practice require? So let's take a look at one of our prayers that we say during the festival of Hanukkah. The Hachamim composed this prayer to commemorate the events. It is called Al-Hanisim, and modeled it after the Al-Hanisim that was composed for Purim. It says as follows: בימי מתתיה בן יוחנן כהן גדול השמונאי ובניו כשען למלכות יוון הרשעה על עמך בית ישראל לבטלם מתורתך ולבעירם מחוקי רצונך ותברך עמך רבים עמדת להם בעד זרעתם ודנת את דינם ורבת את ריבם ונקמת את נקמתם ומסרת גיבורים ביד חלשים וירבים ביד מיעוטים וטמאים ביד טהורים ושרעים ביד צדקים ופשעי ביד עושי תורתך. So it's as follows: in the days of Mattatya, son of Yohanan, the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, when the wicked Greek kingdom rose up against your people, the house of Israel, to annul them from your Torah, and to cause them to transgress the statutes of your will. This prayer describes a systematic program to separate Jews from Torah practice, from normative Torah practice. And it continues, and in your abundant mercy, you stood up for them in their time of distress. You judged their judgment. You fought their fight. You avenged their vengeance. And you delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, and the many into the hands of the few, and the impure into the hands of the pure, and the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the transgressors into the hands of those engaged in your Torah. The language here is explicitly militaristic. Wadanta et dinam, you judged their judgment. Veravta et rivam, you fought their fight. When nakamta et nikmathem, you avenged their vengeance. The Hachamim who composed this prayer knew what they were commemorating. The strong and the many weren't only Seleucid soldiers. They included those within our own Jewish society. He concluded that we must read Hebrew texts with Greek eyes. The few who prevailed were those who insisted on the precise, particular requirements of the Law of Sinai. Notice especially the phrase, Poshe'im b'yad oseh toratecha, transgressors into the hands of those engaged in your Torah. And the prayer concludes, Wa'asita lecha Shem gadol be'olamecha ולעמך ישראל עשית פלא וניסים, כשם שעשית עמהם ניסים וגבורות, כך עשה עמנו. ניסים וגבורות בעת ובעונה הזאת ועל כולם אדוני אלוהינו אנו מודים לך. And you made for yourself a great name in your world. And for your people Israel you performed wonders and miracles, just as you performed miracles and mighty acts with them. So to perform miracles and mighty acts with us at this time and season. And for all these things, Lord our God, we give thanks to you. First, the conflict and divine intervention, then the request that similar miracles be performed in our time. The temple purification and oil are notably absent from this core commemorative prayer, suggesting Chachamim understood those events as integrated parts of a larger story, not as a separate narrative. So now we can address the oil. That single jar of pure oil sealed with the high priest's seal that somehow lasted 8 days. So, some contemporary interpreters have suggested that rabbinic traditions shifted emphasis from military victory to the oil miracle, despite the Al-Hanisim suggesting otherwise, perhaps out of discomfort with violence or to emphasize divine rather than human agency. But I'd like to propose a different reading, one more consistent with how our tradition actually thinks. The oil miracle and the military victory aren't two competing narratives requiring us to choose which really matters. Forcing such a choice reflects very binary thinking, the kind of either or categories that separate matter from spirit, physical from spiritual, this world from the next, secular from holy, religious from non-religious. But Hebrew thought works very differently. It doesn't operate solely in these two valued orientations, which present nothing but false binaries that actually limit understanding. We'll take an example from our own tradition from Yosef, who interprets Pharaoh's dreams in Genesis. 2 separate dreams Pharaoh has, but Yosef says that the 2 different images are expressing one unified reality. Similarly, the oil miracle and military victory form aspects of a single event, 2 manifestations of the same divine providence. Consider what the Hasmoneans had just experienced in this war. The guilt and horror that they had fought other Jews in civil conflict. They had overthrown established religious and political leadership, contradicting the Sanhedrin. They needed confirmation. Were we right? Did we preserve the covenant or did we fracture it? When they entered the temple and found one small jar of pure oil untainted while everything else had been defiled, and when that oil burned impossibly for 8 days, they received an answer. The small jar of pure oil hidden among the contaminated represents clearly the Hasmonean faction itself, a small group maintaining what they saw as purity while surrounded by corruption and somehow surviving until new oil could be produced. The miracle of the oil functions as a divine commentary on the preceding events. It says the revolt was necessary, the covenant was preserved. These 2 dimensions, military victory and the oil miracle, fit together organically. Both manifest divine providence. Separating them misses how they function together in the tradition's understanding. Now that we have more of a framework of what Hanukkah is celebrating, what it is commemorating, let's examine how Rambam structures Hanukkah in its observance and how to carry out this commemoration. Because this precision in how to commemorate reveals the emphasis of the tradition. The Rambam structures his treatment first by presenting the historical context in a very truncated, summarized way. He says, in the Second Temple period, B'bayit Sheni, כשמלכו יוון, גזרו גזרות על ישראל, וביטלו דתם, ולא הניחו אותם לעסוק תורה ומצוות, ופשטו ידם בממונם ובנותיהם, והכנסו להיכל, ופרצו את פרוצות, בטמאו תירוס. וצר להן ישראל מאוד מפניכם, ולחצו לחץ גדול, עד שריחם עליהם אלוהי אבותינו והושיעה מידם. וגברו בני השמונאי, הכהנים הגדולים, והרגו והושיע ישראל מידם, והעמידו מלך מן הכהנים. וחזרה מלכות ישראל יתר על 200 שנה עד החורבן השני. So in the Second Temple period, when the Greeks were ruling in this area after the fall of after Alexander the Great, they issued decrees against Israel and abolished our observance. They did not allow them to engage in Torah and mitzvot. And they stretched their hand against their mamonah, translated as property or money. I believe this is in reference to the sacking of the temple in order to pay for Antiochus's standing army. And they stretched out their hands against our daughters, meaning that they were breaking up our family, so to speak. They entered the temple, they breached it and defiled the pure things. This is in reference to, I believe, the sacrificing of pigs on the altar. And Israel suffered greatly because of them, and they oppressed them with great oppression, until the God of our fathers had mercy on them and saved them from their hand. The sons of the Hasmonean high priest prevailed and killed them and saved Israel from their hands. They established a king from among the priests, and sovereignty returned to Israel for more than 200 years until the second destruction. So that's in reference to the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, I want to point out that it is not legal in Jewish law for the Kohen to be the king. That is a separate office. And so by connecting the king being established amongst the Kohanim, that yes, sovereignty returned to Israel in a way that was taken from us at that point, but we never really regained true independence, and it ultimately led to the destruction of the Second Temple. But more on that another time. Now, we get our specific events of what happened on the 25th of Kisleu and why the 25th of Kisleu is considered to be the day. גברו ישראל על אויביהם ואיבודם ב-25 בחודש כסלו היה. When Israel prevailed over their enemies and destroyed them, it was on the 25th day of the month of Kisleu. So that is the start of the commemoration. Right? That is when we prevailed militarily. And we went into our temple. And right away, we found that everything was defiled. There wasn't anything available to light the menorah with except for one jar of oil. And this just jar wouldn't sustain the menorah except for the one day. Right? So the one it's enough for one lighting. So והדליקו ממנו נרות מערכה 8 ימים עד שקשטו זיתים והוציאו שמן טהור. Yet they went ahead and they kindled the lights, and they lasted for 8 days until they could actually produce olive oil to relight. So that is the commemoration. That's the miracle that happened there. It's the military victory that they were able to overcome their enemies on the 25th of Kisleu, and likewise that they lit this lamp and it stayed lit for 8 days. And because of this, hitkinu hachamim sheb'oto hador שיהיו שמונת הימים האלו, שתחילתן מליל 25 בכסלו, ימי שמחה והלל. Because of this, the sages of that generation, they enacted that these 8 days, which begin on in the evening of the 25th of Kisleu, should be days of joy and Hallel. Simcha and Halel. Simcha is the joy, Hallel is the praise. ومدلكين بهن النرات بعرف عاد بتخي هبتي, and that they should light lamps on the around sunset on the doorposts of their house. Behold, each and every night of the 8 nights of this time. And we're going to call these days the days of Hanukkah, Yemei Hanukkah. And it's forbidden during these 8 days to engage in sort of eulogies, a mourning practice, or in any fasting. Just like the days of Purim. Purim, we also do not fast or mourn. They are sort of like quasi Yomei Tovim, and that, or at least Purim is, and the Hanukkah is similar to it in the sense. And we light our lamps on these days. Mitzvah midivrei sofrim kekirat hamegillah. This is a rabbinic enactment or a rabbinic mitzvah, just like the reading of the Megillah is. I want to notice the structure here. First, we have the historical persecution and deliverance, establishing that sovereignty returned to Israel for over 200 years. And second, the specific victory day and oil miracle. Thirdly, we have the rabbinic enactment establishing the observance of Hanukkah. Each law builds on the previous one, showing how historical events led to our halachic practice. And the key phrase of this halachic practice is mitzvah midivrei sofirim. It's a commandment from the words of the scribes. This distinguishes Hanukkah from the other biblical festivals, as I was saying at the beginning. The Torah commands us to observe Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those are our shalosh regalim, or chagim, pilgrimage festivals with biblical authority. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are Yamim Tovim from the Torah, but Hanukkah is not. Hanukkah is a commemoration established by rabbinic authority to preserve the memory of these events and the lessons they contain. The sages who lived through or immediately after these events determined this must be remembered, this must be marked, household by household, generation after generation. So let's move on to that. The Rambam explains later on in chapter 4, Halacha 12, why this mitzvah has a special significance. It says, Mitzvah ner Hanukkah, mitzvah haviva hi ad me'od. That the mitzvah of Hanukkah, the lamp of Hanukkah, is an exceedingly beloved mitzvah. וצריך אדם להיזהר בה כדי להידיעה הנס ולהוסיף בשמחה הערב הודיה לו על הניסים שעשה. So a person needs to be meticulous with it in order to publicize the miracle and to increase praise of God and thanksgiving to Him for the miracles He had performed. אפילו אין לו מה יוכל אלא מן הצדקה שוער או מוכר כסותו. Even if a person has nothing, they get their sustenance from charity, they are required to ask or to sell their clothing, and to buy oil and lamps, umadlik, and to light them. The phrase mitzvah haviva is a very interesting phrase. It doesn't appear very often. It's a beloved commandment. And what makes this mitzvah so beloved? The Rambam explains that it's in order to publicize the miracle. So which miracle are we talking about? The Rambam has just described both the military victory and the oil. So we see here that Pirsume Nisa, publicizing the miracle, encompasses the entire event. Divine providence in victory, confirmed by divine providence in the oil's duration. That is our miracle. And the Rambam is characteristically precise about the requirements of Nerot Hanukkah. Kama Nerot hu madlik beHanukkah, mitzvata shiye ko bayit ubayit madlik ner echad. Ben shehayu anshei bayit mirubin, ben shelo haya bo ele adam echad. How many lamps are we to kindle? One lamp. Whether there's many people in the house or not so many people in the house, each night of Hanukkah, from first night to the last night, we light one lamp. And that is the mitzvah. Now, umehader et mitzvah, to beautify the mitzvah, we'll say, madlik nerot kiminyan anshe habayit, ne lechol ahad u'ehad, ben anashim, ben nashim. The other approach, the more beautiful approach, is to light a lamp according to the number of people in the home, whether they are male or female, to count them all together, and to light that many each night. So if there are 5 people in the house, you light 5 on the first night, second night, third night, fourth night, and you end with 5 on the 8th night, symbolizing everybody in the house, all 8 days. ומהדר יותר על זה, ועשה מצווה מן המובחר, and to beautify even more, to be even more special, and this is the choicest way of performing this mitzvah. מדליק נר לכל אחד ואחד בלילה הראשון. You light a light according to everybody in the house on the first night. ומוסיף והולך בכל לילה ולילה אחד, and you continue and add on to those lights one light accordingly. So it's the example. If you have 10 people in your home on the first night of Hanukkah, you would light 10 lamps. On the second night, 20, 30, etc., until you get to the 8th night of Hanukkah, where you have 80 lamps aflame. That's a lot of fire. So several points are of significance here. First, we see that this is a household obligation called bayit ubayit. Each household should kindle one lamp. Not each synagogue or each community center, each household. Secondly, even at the mahadrin min ha-mahadrin level, we'll call it, the mitzvah min ha-mufhar, the highest level of observance, quote unquote, we are lighting lamps according to the number of people in the house and increasing based on the number of day. It's still bound to how many people are part of the bayit, how many people are part of the family. I don't think it's about how many people are present in the house, but how many people are part of the family. It is a household ritual incumbent upon the house rather than on individuals. Third, and this is important, the Rambam doesn't mention a shamash, an extra helper candle many communities use. That sort of developed later on, that there was a custom that developed to bring the Hanukkah lamp inside. And it's even addressed in the Mishneh Torah that if it's a time of oppression or persecution and putting your lamp in a public space where it can be visible, visible in a public space, that is dangerous, that you bring it and you put it on your table with dayo, and that's enough. But in order to differentiate that lamp from other lamps or from that light from other lights, you must light a secondary lamp in order to use that lamp's light and not the lamp of the Hanukkah. That being said, in today's world where we have electric lights, the shamash is no longer necessary because the shamash is the electric light. The light that you're using in your home is the electric lighting. So a shamash is not halachically necessary per se. Only in the event that for whatever reason you're lighting in your house and there's no other lighting, you have to have an other light source so you're not benefiting or using the Hanukkah light for mundane purposes. It's a symbolic light only. So let's take a look at where do we place this Hanukkah. Ner Hanukkah mitzvah lehincho al petach beto mibahos. Betefach hasamuch lepetach. Asimol הנכנס לבית, כדי שהיא תהיה מזוזה מימין, ונר חנוכה משמאל. So where do you place this lamp? You place it on your door outside, about a tefach about a hand's breadth from the actual door itself, on the left-hand side as you are going in. And this way, you're surrounded by your mitzvot here. You're surrounded by, on the right-hand side, you have the mezuzah, and on the left-hand side, you have the ner Hanukkah. You have the Hanukkah lamp. Ve'im haya darb aliyah, and this is assuming you live on the ground floor, where people will see from the street walking by, they see your lamp. So what happens if you live upstairs? What if you live off the street level? Ve'im haya darb aliyah, if you live in an upper building, maniha b'halon, you place it in a window next to the public thoroughfare. And it's similar to the laws of Sukkot. If a person if the Hanukkah is too high, if it's more than 20 amos high, nobody can see it, nobody can recognize it, therefore it does not fulfill the obligation. So the location requirements we see are specific. Either outside your doorway or in a window visible from the public thoroughfare. Why? Because the point is Pirsum Nisa, publicizing the miracle to passers-by in the public domain. We have to ask some questions about what that actually means and how, if our contemporary practices fulfill these obligations. Lighting a menorah inside a large hall or event room, regardless of how many people attend or how televised it is, doesn't fulfill this specific requirement. The halacha isn't about having many people see it. It's about the lamp being visible to people passing by your home. So why emphasize this? Because it connects to something deeper about what Hanukkah commemorates. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari distinguishes between invented customs, which everything is fuzzy and subjective, versus our precisely defined law, which he sees as one of Judaism's unique characteristics. The entire Mishnah, for example, demonstrates this precision. Detailed instructions about how to perform each mitzvah, each ritual, each Jewish act. This precision isn't pedantic. It reflects something fundamental about how Torah functions. Not as a collection of symbols pointing to abstract ideas, but as a concrete system of practice where the details matter. This brings us to an important question. Why are Nerot Hanukkah performed specifically in the Bayit? Why is that what satisfies the mitzvah? The Bayit isn't merely a home in our modern sense of private domestic space. In Israelite tradition, the Bayit functions as a political institution, actually the first Israelite political institution. Long before there was a monarchy, before there was a temple, before there was even a tabernacle, there was a bayit. The Pesach offering in Egypt was performed bayit by bayit. The blood on the doorpost marked each household as belonging to a covenant. The fundamental unit of Israelite society was the bayit. This is really our Hebrew word for family. Not mishpacha, as we use today, which seems to designate a larger family, a more extended family. Bayit are those you share that space with. And historical experience taught an important pattern. When central institutions fail, when the priesthood becomes compromised, when national leadership loses its way, the people have somewhere to return. The bayit. This is what the Hasmonean moment exemplifies. When the temple itself had become compromised, and when the high priest represented a Hellenizing faction, introduced foreign reforms to our law, when Jerusalem's establishment had moved away from what the Hasmoneans saw as our law and our connection, resistance rooted itself in the households. The Sanhedrin in Jerusalem at the time wanted to install a statue of Zeus in the temple, and were using all sorts of justifications why Judaism approves of this and why traditional Judaism allows for such a construction of a statue of Zeus in the temple. It was the Hasmonean family unit, the bayit, that stood up against them, and the other homes, other houses, other families that joined them in carrying the fight. The requirement to light Nerot Hanukkah in each bayit carries a symbolic weight. It declares Jewish fidelity to Torah, doesn't depend solely on the temple or the priesthood or the rabbinate or any single central authority. Each household can maintain the covenant, the berit, independently. This is why household observance matters so much for this particular holiday. It's not merely about where the candles are lit, it's about what the location represents. Decentralized faithfulness, bayit by bayit, household by household, preserving tradition even when larger institutions falter. There's a fundamental halachic principle at work here, one that distinguishes Sinaitic law from rabbinic legislation. The Sanhedrin has authority to legislate dinim muflaim, which are like ambiguous regulations requiring interpretation and implementation. And there's takanot, which are enactments, the gezerot, which are decrees. These have no precedent, and they're usually they're not something that you can just learn independently from the text. The Yerushalmi teaches that regarding these matters specifically, even if the court's ruling seems to be abstract or incorrect based off of a de novo reading of the text, you follow the interpretation of the court. But regarding the law of Sinai, the core principles transmitted to the Jewish people, the principle here differs. The same passage in the Yerushalmi says, could it be that if the Supreme Court, will tell you that the right is left or that the left is right, that you should comply with them? That is why Scripture stated, do not sway off from the pronouncement that they tell you either to the right or to the left. Only when they ascertain that the right is right and the left is left, you must comply with them. That shows here that the court is beholden to the people. For the people themselves serve as the repository of the law of Sinai. We bear responsibility to preserve it and to ensure that leadership doesn't negate our fundamental responsibilities or our fundamental relationship to our Creator. History demonstrates this. If the Sanhedrin were to negate a Torah commandment and nobody protested, those who remained would have a transformed Judaism. Had there been no Hasmonaim, the changes to temple practice might have become permanent, and our law, Torah, covenant would have disappeared. This is part of what Nerot Hanukkah symbolizes. When your leadership fails, you light your own lamp. When central institutions falter, you maintain covenant in your home. Each household becomes a repository of traditional practice and the crucible in which the next generation is instructed. So let's take a look. I want to turn now to an ancient Jewish source that offers a fascinating perspective on how Hanukkah was understood in the first century. In Josephus' Jewish Antiquities, which was written around 93, 94. It follows the account in the first Maccabees closely, but his differences are quite revealing. And it sort of shows us actually where we get a term for this holiday, namely the Festival of Lights. Josephus is the first to dub it that. It says as follows. The generals of Antiochus's armies having been defeated, Judah Maccabee assembled the people and told them that after the many victories which God had given them, they ought to go up to Jerusalem and purify the temple and offer the sacrifices that were appointed. But when he, with the whole multitude, came to Jerusalem and found the temple deserted, they saw that its gates were burned down and plants were growing wild in the temple of their own accord. He and those with him began to weep and lament in their distress at the sight of the temple. So he chose some of his soldiers and gave them an order to fight off men from the upper city until they have purified the temple. When they had carefully purged it, they brought in new vessels, and the menorah, the table, and the incense altar, which were made of gold, and hung up the veils at the door and restored the doors themselves. He also took down the altar and built a new one of stones, the altar that had pig sacrificed on it, and gathered together new stones that had not had iron tools to shape them. And on the 25th day of the month of Kisleu, with all the Macedonian, which the Macedonians call apelaios, they lighted the lights, phota in Greek, that were on the menorah, and offered incense upon the altar, and laid the loaves upon the table, and offered whole burnt offerings upon the new altar. As it happened, these things took place on the very same day on which 3 years before the divine worship had been reduced to an impure and profane form of worship. For the temple had remained desolate for 3 years after being made so by Antiochus. And the desolation of the temple came about in accordance with the prophecy of Daniel, which had been made 408 years before, for he had revealed that the Macedonians would destroy it. And so Judah and his fellow citizens celebrated the festival of the restoration for the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days, and omitted no sort of pleasure. But everyone feasted upon very rich and splendid sacrifices, and they honored God, and they delighted themselves with psalms of praise and the playing of harps. Indeed, they were so very glad at the revival of their customs, and after so long a time having unexpectedly regained their right to worship, that they made it a law for their posterity that they should keep a festival celebrating the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this, which we call the Festival of Lights, or the Festival of Phota, because I imagine, he says, beyond our hopes, this rite was brought to light, phanai, in Greek, and so this name was placed on the festivals. Notice First, what's absent from Josephus' account? It's similar to our reading of Al-Nisim. There's no story of finding a small jar of pure oil that miraculously burned for 8 days. Josephus mentions lighting the lights of the menorah on the 25th of Kisleu, but he describes no miracle connected to the oil itself. So Josephus is writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, and the miracle of Hanukkah here refers to gaining against all odds the freedom to worship and follow ancestral customs, and he makes a sort of play on words that this rite was brought to light, and so that's the Festival of Lights there. So here's something crucial. Josephus is the only ancient author to call this holiday the Festival of Lights. First Maccabees calls it the Festival of the Dedication, in Kainia, I think, in Greek, which is also what it's called in the Gospels when we see that there is a celebration of Hanukkah. And it directly translates the Hebrew word Hanukkah into Greek. Hanukkah means dedication. It's the same word we use for sort of the early education of a child, is lechinuch. You are dedicating that child to a life of understanding the Torah. And Hanukkah HaMizbeach, they dedicated the altar. That's why it's also called Hanukkah. They rededicated the altar and rededicated the temple for the service there. Well, that's Hanukkah. And that's what it's called in rabbinic literature. That's what everybody called it. But Josephus creates a new name, the Festival of Fota, the Festival of Lights. Notice his awkward, almost apologetic explanation. Because I imagine, beyond our hopes, this rite was brought to light. It's very it doesn't fit the narrative. It's just sort of like a afterthought play on words. He's offering a sort of metaphorical explanation, interpretation here. Freedom brought out of darkness into light. The phrase "I imagine" even suggests he's creating his own interpretation rather than transmitting a received tradition. And this is strange. The Greek word he uses, phota, clearly means actual lights, though. Plural, a collection of physical lamps. Just sentences earlier, he wrote, they lighted the lights. And he uses the word phota there that were on the menorah. So he could easily connect the name of the temple, the name of Hanukkah to the temple menorah lighting, but he doesn't. So why not? We need to understand the moment Josephus is writing in. It's roughly 20 years after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 68, the very temple the Hasmoneans had rededicated. The temple menorah itself, supposedly the very menorah Judah Maccabee had lit, had been carried off to Rome and paraded through the streets in Titus's triumph. It's depicted on the Arch of Titus, which still stands today. Josephus is writing for a Roman audience, trying desperately to improve Jewish-Roman relations. He hopes the temple might eventually be rebuilt, so every word he must be chosen very carefully. In his time, the Hanukkah story represents dangerous parallels to their recent Jewish revolt, which was a successful uprising against foreign rule, the purification and rededication of the temple that Rome had just destroyed. The celebration involving lamp lighting that recalls the very menorah now displayed as spoils of war in Rome. All of this could be read as seditious. The very act of Jews lighting Hanukkah lamps could appear as a covert reenactment of temple dedication, a symbolic rejection of Roman authority. So Josephus makes a strategic choice. He invents a new name, Festival of Lights, and gives it a safe, metaphorical explanation about freedom brought to light. He distances the lamp lighting from the temple menorah. He emphasizes that the Hanukkah menorah has 8 branches, distinct from the 7-branched temple menorah the Rome possesses. It is protective coloration. Josephus is providing Jews with a way to maintain their tradition while avoiding the appearance of rebellion. We are not reenacting temple dedication, the name seems to say. We're celebrating an abstract idea, freedom as light. But here's the irony. This politically motivated renaming Festival of Lights is what most English speakers today call Hanukkah. We've adopted Josephus' Roman-era damage control as our primary name for the holiday, often forgetting that the actual name is Hanukkah, dedication. The real name preserves what Josephus was trying to obscure, that this commemoration is about the rededication of the temple, about the restoration of Jewish practice after it had been compromised, about household-based resistance when our institutions failed. Josephus' careful maneuvering reveals something important. The Hasmonean story wasn't ancient history to his generation. It was uncomfortably, dangerously relevant. They too had revolted against foreign rule. They too had seen their temple defiled and destroyed. The question of when resistance is justified, when compromise becomes capitulation, these weren't academic questions. They were lived realities with devastating consequences. Notice what Josephus also admits from First Maccabees. That book mentions putting aside the stones of the defiled altar until a prophet could come and give a decision about them. In other words, we don't know what to do with these stones, and so we need a prophet to come to tell us yay or nay or how to approach them. This references messianic expectations, waiting for a prophet like Eliyahu HaNavi to come and answer these hard questions. Josephus deliberately censors this inflammatory idea at precisely the moment when messianic prophecies had fueled the revolt against Rome. So even as Josephus renames the festival to make it politically safer, even as he distances the lamp lighting from temple service, he preserves the memory. Empires that defile God's sanctuary face divine judgment. The Seleucids fell, and the same pattern, he hints, will repeat with Rome. When we light Hanukkah lamps today, we participate in a tradition that has always carried political weight. A reminder that Jewish practice and Jewish political autonomy have never been easily separable. The household preservation of covenant has repeatedly proven essential when central institutions fall. Even the name we use, whether Hanukkah or Festival of Lights, reflects decisions made under pressure about how to code switch and to preserve dangerous memories in hostile times. So what might Hanukkah mean for us today? The prominence Hanukkah has acquired in some communities, particularly in North America, has more to do with its proximity to Christmas on the calendar than with its significance in Jewish tradition. Understanding this matters. When we inflate Hanukkah to compete with Christmas, when we emphasize gifts and decorations and treat it as our winter holiday, we risk missing what that commemoration actually preserves. A complicated, challenging story about the internal Jewish conflict, about household-based loyalty to tradition when the surrounding environment changes or even becomes hostile. The sages established this commemoration precisely because they understood these questions would reoccur. It's worth noting that while Hanukkah falls near the winter solstice, it differs fundamentally from universal light festivals. The Talmud, tellingly in Avodah Zarah, Masechet Avodah Zarah, actually acknowledges psychological responses to seasonal darkness. It describes how Adam, seeing days shorten towards the solstice, feared the world was returning to chaos because of his sin. He fasted for 8 days, and when the days began lengthening afterwards, after the solstice had passed, he understood that this is the order of the world, and he celebrated. for 8 days more. The following year, he observed 16 days altogether. And the Talmud concludes, he, Adam, established these festivals for the sake of heaven, but later generations established them for idol worship. This passage acknowledges universal human responses to winter darknesses while explaining how pagan festivals like Saturnalia emerged. But Hanukkah commemorates something particular. Not seasonal cycles, but a specific historical crisis. It recalls when the questions became urgent. What happens when leadership reinterprets tradition in ways that seem sophisticated and universal but fundamentally alter what's been received? The Hasmoneans insisted on the precise requirements and the specific covenant, not merely as vehicles for abstract ideas, but as substance itself. The Torah isn't a philosophical system translatable into other frameworks. It's our unique, concrete way of life, preserved through our memory, our homes, and our specific practices. The holiday doesn't offer easy answers of how to engage with those questions today, but it asks us to wrestle with these tensions seriously. As we prepare to enter Kisleu, I want to return to where we began, with the name of this month and what it teaches us. Kisleu connects once again to hope, confidence, that during this month, the land of Israel will receive its rain, which we expect with hopeful expectation. They are the Yoreh, the early rains that start in Mar Heshvan. There's an evocative connection in Hebrew between rain and teaching. The word Yoreh, Yod Waw Resh He, for early rains, shares its root, which is Yod Resh He, with Torah and Hora'ah, meaning teaching or instruction. The image is powerful. Just as rain pours down from heaven to make the earth fruitful, so divine teaching, so does Torah flow from our Creator to nourish our soul. Just as the land needs both the Yoreh and the Malkosh, the early rains and the late rains, to produce harvest, so we need the continuous instruction of Torah, the steady rain of divine teaching to produce the fruits of a life lived in covenant. The Torah is more than symbolism. It is nourishment for our soul and helps us to develop into good human beings. When the Hasmoneans entered the temple and found that single jar of pure oil, sealed, untainted, hidden away, while everything else had been corrupted, they must have wondered, is this enough? Can this small amount sustain us? The answer was 8 days of impossible burning. The answer was the divine confirmation. Yes, your faithfulness matters. Yes, even vastly outnumbered, even facing constant and considerable opposition, covenant fidelity is not in vain. And think about what they have accomplished. A small group defeated a professional standing army and replaced a corrupt ruling class. This is more improbable than the Continental Army defeating Cornwallis in Yorktown. This is the confident hope that Kisleu embodies. Not naive optimism that everything will work out automatically, but grounded confidence that when we maintain our fidelity to the Torah and carry out its precise requirements, when we insist that the forms matter, that particular commandments cannot be abstracted into universal principles, we align ourselves with the same divine providence that makes the rain fall and the days lengthen. Each night during Hanukkah, when you light your lamp and place it in your window or in your doorway, your house, you participate in something ancient and enduring. You join yourself to that small jar of pure oil that the Hasmoneans, who insisted that precision and observance isn't pedantic but faithfulness, to the long line of Jewish households who preserved Torah when larger institutions faltered. The rains fall, the days lengthen, the oil burns. The Torah instructs, and faithful Jews, household by household, family by family, preserve the berith, the covenant, when institutions face challenges. This is what Kisleu teaches, and this is what Hanukkah commemorates. This is the hope we kindle light by light. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of Kisleu and Hanukkah. If this episode enriched your understanding, I ask two things. First, share it with someone who might find value in this approach to Jewish learning. Second, consider joining our community on Patreon, where your engagement and support at whatever level is meaningful to you allow us to continue our study and to delve deeper into your questions and thoughts. Our Patreon community is a place for deeper conversation, for wrestling with the questions these episodes raise, and for learning together. It is our effort to preserve and transmit a particular way of engaging with Jewish tradition, one that insists on textual precision, embraces historical complexity, and trusts that our sources can speak powerfully when we let them speak on their own terms. Your partnership in this endeavor matters, and we thank you very much. Thank you again for joining us for this exploration of Kisleu. Next month, we will return to the month of Tevet, the month when the walls close in, when the siege of Jerusalem begins, when we confront the consequences of national division and the long work of rebuilding what has been broken. Until then, may your Hanukkah lights burn with confident hope. May your household be a place where Torah is preserved and practiced faithfully, and may we have the wisdom to navigate the tensions each generation inherits. Hodesh Tov Mevorach Al Vermos. Until next time.